arrived in Amherst, Nova Scotia on a cold autumn evening in 1878, the kind of cold that slips through your coat, through your skin, like an unseen hand pressing down on your bones. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours before, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the frozen ground. I'd heard whispers about the Cox family, about a young woman named Esther, plagued by strange happenings. It wasn't the kind of case that made the front page of the papers, but among the locals, it was all anyone could talk about. Esther lived in a modest, 2-story house on the edge of town, the kind of house that creaked with every gust of wind, its walls heavy with the weight of too many secrets. Her brother-in-law, a man of few words, met me at the door. His face was pale, eyes hollow, as though he hadn't slept in weeks. There was something else in his gaze, something more than exhaustion. It was fear, a primal sort of terror that clung to him like the stench of death. "She's upstairs," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I wouldn't go near her, not alone." I nodded, more out of politeness than agreement. I'd heard stories like this before, tales of haunting and possession, of young women marked by forces beyond comprehension. Usually it amounted to little more than overactive imaginations and superstition. But there was something about the house, about the way the air inside it felt heavier, denser, as though the very walls were watching you. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, each step slower than the last. The upper floor was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears until you can hear the rush of your own blood. I found Esther in the corner of a small, dimly lit room. Her back was to me, her hair matted and wild, as if she hadn't brushed it in days. Her body was rigid, her shoulders hunched, as though bracing herself against some invisible blow. "Esther?" I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. For a moment she didn't move, didn't even breathe. And then, without warning, she turned her head just enough for me to see her face. Her eyes, wide and dark, full of something I couldn't quite name, locked onto mine, and I felt my stomach twist. There was no recognition there, no warmth, just raw, unfiltered terror. "He's here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He's always here." I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. Who's here, Esther?" She didn't answer. Instead, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the air took on a palpable weight, pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel it, something moving in the shadows, watching, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to hold her gaze. The bed beside her suddenly groaned, the heavy wood frame creaking as if someone had sat down on it. But no one was there. A gust of freezing wind swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker, a brief, fleeting shape that darted past the edge of the bed and disappeared into the darkness. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. I had been in many dark places, but there was something different about this. This wasn't just a haunting. It felt personal. It felt alive. The next few hours passed in a blur of eerie noises, footsteps in empty hallways, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves, but it was the nights that terrified me most. Every time the house settled, every creak or groan of the floorboards, I imagined something, someone, watching from the shadows. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if the house itself was alive, feeding on our fear. It was late, perhaps close to midnight, when the first real incident happened. Esther was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she gripped a cup of tea. Her sister, a woman of sharp features and tight lips, hovered near the doorway, her eyes darting from me to Esther with growing unease. Without warning, Esther's body jolted as though struck by an invisible hand. The cup in her hand shattered, sending shards of porcelain skittering across the floor. Before any of us could react, the table shook violently, as though something beneath it was trying to claw its way out. A scream tore from Esther's throat, raw and primal, as her body convulsed in spasms that sent her sprawling to the floor. I rushed to her side, but the moment I touched her, something cold and intangible, wrapped around my wrist. It felt like ice, like the grip of death itself. I jerked my hand away, my pulse pounding in my ears, as Esther's eyes snapped open. They weren't her eyes anymore. The room seemed to shift, the shadows growing deeper, darker, swallowing the weak glow of the lanterns. A low growl echoed from somewhere nearby, but it wasn't human. It wasn't of this world. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Esther lay still on the floor, her body limp, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was silent again, but the air was thick with an unseen presence, something dark and ancient that had awoken, and it wasn't going to leave. I glanced down at my wrist where I had felt the cold grip. There, etched into my skin like a brand, was a faint handprint, a child's handprint. That night, I didn't sleep, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Something had claimed Esther Cox. Something was haunting her, and now it had its eyes on me. The following morning, the air in the house felt even heavier, as if the walls had drawn closer during the night. The daylight did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to cling to every corner, every shadow. Esther was quiet, too quiet. She sat by the window, staring out at the gray sky, her hands folded in her lap as if waiting for something, or someone. The bruise-colored circles under her eyes told me she hadn't slept. I hadn't either. I paced the floor of the sitting room, trying to make sense of what had happened the night before. Poltergeist activity was one thing, but this felt different. There was intent behind the chaos. A mind, a will, a force that wasn't just throwing things around to scare us. It was trying to break something. Esther, maybe. Or worse, it was trying to break me. I couldn't shake the image of that child's handprint burned into my skin. When I'd woken up, it was gone, as though it had never existed. But the memory of its icy grip stayed with me, clinging to my thoughts like a stubborn shadow. Around noon, Esther's sister called me to the kitchen. "You should see this," she said, her voice tight with fear. I followed her, my stomach knotting, knowing whatever it was wouldn't be good. The kitchen floor was littered with objects, cutlery, plates, pots, strewn about like a hurricane had torn through the room. But that wasn't what caught my eye. Scrawled across the walls in deep, jagged scratches were words. "He is mine. She will suffer. The pain has only begun." I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. There was something vicious about the way the letters cut into the wood, like claws had ripped them out. And then, from behind me, Esther's voice. "He's not going to stop." I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a kind of resignation that chilled me to the core. She wasn't afraid anymore. No, it was worse. She had accepted it. "What does he want, Esther?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her gaze shifted to the wall, to the cruel words etched into it. "He wants me to remember." Remember what? I stepped closer, but she didn't look at me. Her focus was fixed on something distant, something I couldn't see. "The night he came," she whispered. "The night I thought it was over." Her sister shifted uncomfortably by the door, her face hard with worry, but she said nothing. Esther's hand rose to her throat, fingers brushing against a fading bruise, barely visible beneath the high collar of her dress. I knew then. The rumors had been true. Esther had survived something brutal, and whatever had happened had torn a rift in her world. A door had been opened, and something had stepped through, something that fed on her pain, her fear. "Tell me about that night," I pressed gently. For a moment, she didn't move, her body as still as the air around us, and then slowly she began to speak. "It was late. I'd just come back from town. The roads were empty, and I thought..." She paused, her voice faltering. "I thought I was safe. I didn't see him until it was too late." I didn't need her to say more. The details didn't matter as much as the weight behind them, the unspoken horror in her eyes. Trauma, it had a way of warping reality. Sometimes it created things, monsters that lived in the mind, nightmares that clung to the edges of waking life. But this was different. This was no mere memory. "I tried to forget," she continued, her voice hollow. "But he won't let me. He follows me in the house, in my dreams. He laughs at me. He enjoys it." A chill ran down my spine. I knew well enough that once something like this took root in a person, it was almost impossible to tear it out. This was no ordinary haunting. It was a parasite, feeding on Esther's misery, growing stronger with every passing day. Suddenly the lights flickered. A cold draft swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. Esther's sister backed away from the door, her eyes wide with fear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, the air humming with something unseen, something malevolent. And then, from upstairs, a loud crash shattered the silence. We all froze. The sound had come from Esther's room. Without thinking, I rushed to the stairs, taking them two at a time. The hallway upstairs was darker than it should have been, the shadows deep and suffocating. As I approached her room, the door stood ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. I pushed it open. The room was in disarray. The bed, once neatly made, was overturned, sheets tangled and ripped. The window was wide open, though there was no sign of anyone having come or gone. And then I saw it, etched into the wall above the bed, deeper than before, the scratches more violent. "She belongs to me." My breath caught in my throat. Something else was written beneath it, smaller, almost like a whisper. It was hard to make out at first. but as I moved closer, I could see it clearly. He's still here. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but it wasn't just the door that closed. The air itself seemed to press in on me, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath in the gloom. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge, and then I heard it, a low, rasping breath. Not mine. Something else. I turned slowly, the weight of unseen eyes on my back. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight ripple in the dark. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. It was small, hunched, and unnatural, its limbs too long, its head too large. It crouched there, watching me, its breath coming in shallow, raspy gasps. My stomach turned as the smell hit me, a mix of rot and decay, like something long dead had crawled into the room with me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare as it slowly began to crawl forward, inching its way across the floor. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and then, in one terrible moment, it looked up. Its eyes, black and hollow, met mine, and a sound, a grotesque gurgle, escaped its throat. And then it smiled. That's when I felt it, the icy grip around my wrist, that same cold, childlike hand. Only this time, it didn't let go. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shatter my ribs. The thing in the corner, if it even was a thing, moved with a grotesque grace, sliding along the floor like a spider, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. Its smile never faltered, wide and too human, stretched across a face that seemed to blur and distort with every breath. But the worst part was the hand, the icy grip around my wrist. This time it wasn't just cold. It felt like something was burrowing under my skin, like tiny claws digging deeper and deeper, pulling at me, trying to drag me into that corner of darkness where it waited. My mind screamed at me to run, to break free, but my body refused to move. I could only stand there, paralyzed, as that thing crept closer. It was then that I heard it. Esther's voice, soft at first, like a distant echo, but growing louder, more desperate. "He's coming for you now," she whispered from the hallway, her voice barely audible over the sound of the thing's raspy breathing. "He's chosen you." The door behind me creaked open, but I couldn't turn around. My eyes were locked on the creature, now just inches from me, its foul breath hot against my skin despite the frigid air. It reached out a hand, small, pale, covered in filth, and I could see the jagged nails curling inward like talons. In that instant, something broke inside me. The paralysis snapped, and I wrenched my arm free from its invisible grasp, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. But the thing didn't stop. It crawled forward, faster now, more desperate, its grin widening impossibly until its face seemed to split in two. I could feel its hunger, its need to claim me, to pull me into whatever dark, twisted world it came from. I reached for the door, my fingers slipping on the cold wood, but when I yanked it open, what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The hallway was gone. Instead, there was nothing but darkness, an endless void stretching out before me. The house, the world beyond it, had disappeared. All that remained was this room, this thing, and the void that threatened to swallow me whole. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But the icy grip around my wrist, the childlike handprint that still throbbed with a cold, unnatural ache, told me otherwise. I wasn't just being haunted. I was being claimed. The thing lunged at me, its twisted limbs moving with a speed that defied reason. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as it slammed into the wall where I'd stood. The impact shook the room, a low growl rumbling through the floorboards as the creature slowly turned its head toward me, its grin stretching even wider. And then it spoke, not in words but in a sound, low, guttural, almost like a whisper, but filled with something ancient, something hungry. The hairs on my arm stood up as the noise slithered into my ears, burrowing deep into my brain. It wasn't a language I could understand, but its meaning was clear. "You're next." The room seemed to pulse with that terrible sound, the shadows growing darker, deeper, until they swallowed everything. I couldn't see the creature anymore, but I could feel it, moving, circling me, waiting for the moment to strike. I fumbled for the lantern on the floor, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The flame flickered weakly in the encroaching darkness, barely holding it at bay, but it was enough to show me the way out. There, just beyond the bed, was a window. Not the void I had seen in the doorway, but an actual window, cracked open, leading out into the night. It was my only chance. Without thinking, I bolted for it. My feet pounded against the floor, the darkness snapping at my heels as I reached the window. I shoved it open, the cold night air rushing in, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed through, my hands scraping against the rough wood, and dropped down to the ground below. The moment my feet hit the earth, everything went still. The air was cold, biting, but there was no wind. The night was eerily quiet, not even the rustle of leaves to break the silence. I stood there, breathing hard, staring up at the window I had just escaped from. The room was dark now, no light, no movement. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I turned, stumbling toward the woods at the edge of the property, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of that thing, its twisted limbs, its grotesque grin, burned itself into my thoughts. I hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever had claimed Esther was now after me. I could feel it, even in the open air. The presence of something cold and ancient lurking just out of sight. Watching. Waiting. I reached the tree line, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and stopped. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels, but there in the shadows between the trunks, something moved. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the adrenaline warping my senses. But as I squinted into the darkness, I saw it. Two black eyes staring back at me. And then, a voice, a child's voice, soft, innocent, but dripping with malice. "Come back inside." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks, growing louder, more insistent. "Come back. We're waiting for you." I took a step back, my blood turning to ice. That's when I saw it. The figure in the woods, small and hunched, like a child, but wrong. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs too long, too thin. And in its hand, dangling from its fingers, was a doll. But it wasn't just any doll. It was Esther's. The creature grinned at me, its eyes gleaming with a dark, malevolent light. And then it took a step forward. "I'll see you soon," it whispered, before vanishing into the shadows. The world around me spun, my knees buckling as I collapsed to the ground. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because I knew. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it was coming for me. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed me too. The world around me was spinning, the dark trees closing in like a cage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the woods was getting closer. My breaths came in sharp gasps, my mind racing through every possible way out. But no matter how I turned it, no matter how fast I ran, I knew deep down that I couldn't escape. Not like this. I sat there, knees buckled beneath me, the icy wind biting at my skin. And then, something strange happened, something unexpected. A memory surfaced in the haze of fear and panic. I remembered Esther's voice, her words ringing clearly in my mind. "He wants me to remember." It hit me like a bolt of lightning. This thing, this force, wasn't just feeding off Esther's pain and fear. It was connected to her trauma. It had latched onto her when she'd been at her weakest, using that darkness to grow stronger, to manifest. The more she suffered, the more powerful it became. And now it had found a new target. Me. I had two choices: keep running and let the terror consume me, or face it head on. I stood up, my legs shaky, but my resolve solidifying. If this thing fed on fear, then maybe there was another way. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tables. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to walk back toward the house. Every step felt like 1,000 pounds of pressure on my chest, the cold air growing heavier with each breath. The thing in the woods, it was watching, but it wasn't following. Not yet. I reached the house, its dark silhouette looming over me like some forgotten tomb. The window I had crawled through earlier stood open, a gaping maw beckoning me to return. Without hesitation, I climbed back inside, my heart pounding in my throat. The room was as cold and dark as before, but something had shifted. The air didn't feel quite as oppressive, not as suffocating. I stepped toward the center of the room, my eyes scanning the shadows. It was still here. I could feel it. "Show yourself," I said, my voice steady but low. "I know what you are." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and unnerving. But then, from the corner of the room, that familiar rasping breath echoed through the air. The thing emerged from the shadows, its form twisting and warping as it crawled toward me. Its eyes were darker than ever, its grin wide and menacing, but I didn't flinch. "You don't scare me," I said, louder this time. "Not anymore." The creature stopped, its head tilting in a strange, almost confused way, as if it hadn't expected this. I kept my voice calm, my heartbeat slowing. "You're not real. You're just a manifestation. You only have power if I let you." Its grin faltered, and the air in the room shifted again. The temperature seemed to rise just a little, as if the darkness was losing its grip. "You fed on Esther's pain, didn't you?" I took a step closer, my fear fading as I spoke. "You latched onto her when she was broken, when she thought she was alone. But she's not alone anymore." The creature hissed, its long, twisted limbs twitching, but it didn't move. It couldn't. I could feel its power weakening. I knelt beside the bed where Esther had suffered night after night, where the thing had tormented her. I ran my hand across the sheets, cold and frayed, and whispered, "You can't hurt her anymore." The creature shrieked, a high-pitched wail that pierced the air, and in an instant it lunged at me, its long arms reaching out, but I didn't move. I stood my ground, meeting its black, soulless eyes with unwavering resolve. And just as it reached me, just as those twisted, unnatural limbs were about to wrap around my throat, something incredible happened. The room flooded with light, not the weak, flickering light of a lantern, but a bright, warm glow that bathed every corner of the room. The darkness retreated, evaporating in the presence of that light, and the creature shrieked in agony, its form distorting and crumbling before my eyes. It writhed on the floor, its long limbs collapsing in on themselves, its body shrinking until it was nothing more than a black, oily stain on the wooden floorboards. The wail faded into a soft whimper, and then silence. I stood there, blinking in the sudden brightness, my heart still racing. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. The thing, whatever it had been, was gone, completely gone, and then from behind me, a voice. "Thank you." I turned to see Esther standing in the doorway. Her face, once pale and haunted, was now soft, peaceful. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "It's over," she whispered, stepping into the room. "He's gone." I nodded, still in shock, but a wave of relief washed over me. Whatever had haunted Esther, whatever had tormented her for so long, was finally gone. The house, once oppressive and cold, felt lighter, almost welcoming. I followed her down the stairs and out into the morning light. The sky was bright now, the sun casting a warm glow over the town of Amherst. Birds chirped in the distance, and the cold that had clung to the air was gone. "Will you be all right?" I asked, turning to her. She nodded, a quiet strength in her eyes. "Yes, I think I will be, thanks to you." I smiled and began walking toward the edge of the property, the weight of the past few days lifting off my shoulders with every step. But before I left, I turned back one last time. Esther stood in the doorway, bathed in the morning sun. The shadows that had once clung to her were gone, and in their place was something I hadn't seen before. Hope. Whatever dark force had haunted her was gone, and for the first time in a long while, I believed in happy endings.